Very good morning. Live from ZTN studios in Harare, Zimbabwe. Welcome to the Mint Special. Our discussion this morning, Intergovernmental Fiscal Funds Transfer Framework and the 2021 National Budget, Implications for Devolution. Hello, I'm Andy Hodges. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV network ZTN and our partners, the National Citizen Devolution Task Force, represented by the We Pay You Deliver Consortium. Now, should you have any comments or views on our show, as usual, please contact us via our Facebook page, Zim Papers TV Network, or via our Twitter handle @ZTN News. The Comprehensive Devolution and Decentralization Policy is now out, fleshing out the constitutional requirements and spelling out strategies for the successful implementation of the national agenda to promote development across the country's 10 provinces. The policy document details the implementation framework, local government structures, devolved functions, citizen participation, devolution, and Vision 2030. It also covers financing resources, role clarity, and devolved service delivery, staffing for the devolved mandates, and financial and administrative capacity, among other key deliverables. In his foreword, Zimbabwe's President Mnangagwa said devolution was adopted as a key component of the new 2013 constitution. Devolution ensures the preservation of national unity in Zimbabwe, prevention of all forms of disunity, and the democratic participation in government by Zimbabweans. One major guideline in the devolution and decentralization policy is the transferring of local fiscal responsibilities and resources from the national government to subnational entities in order to establish a sound financial base for each provincial and metropolitan council and local authorities in rural areas. Joining us on the Mint Special this morning to interrogate Intergovernmental Fiscal Funds Transfer Framework and the 2021 National Budget, Implications for Devolution are Vinechimwe Churu, Permanent Secretary in Zimbabwe's Ministry of Local Government and Public Works, David Matumbike, National Coordinator for the Local Governance Trust, and joining us virtually during the program are Dr. Vincent Chakunda from Midland State University and Dr. Davison Muchandianyika, Independent Local Government Expert. Gentlemen, welcome to the Mint Special.
Thank you, Bonnie.
Now, Mr. Churu, since promulgation of the 2013 Constitution, there have been various conversations on devolution funds intended for other sub-tiers of government. Can you please briefly explain the constitutional provisions relating to intergovernmental fiscal funds transfers to subnational governments in Zimbabwe, and that is provincial metropolitan councils as well as rural and urban local authorities?
Thank you, Andy. There are a number of provisions in the Constitution 2013 Constitution, which speak to devolution, particularly on devolution funds. But I will speak to two areas. There's one which is Section 298. 298 says that resources, public resources, should be utilized for the development of Zimbabwe. In particular, it mentions the fact that they must be focused on the marginalized groups, and also that those resources should be equitably shared amongst the three tiers of government. Most viewers will be aware of one major provision which is most spoken about, which is Section 301, I think it is subsection 3, which says that at least 5% of budget, central government budget resources should be directed towards the provincial and local government tiers. But having said that, one can pick a number of provisions from the Constitution which speak to this subject, sometimes in an indirect manner, but when you put all these things together, they are comprehensive, and it speaks to the subject of devolution as a key aspect of the governance system in Zimbabwe.
In a recent interview, in a recent meeting, virtual meeting with Zim Papers editors, the local government and public works minister, Honorable July Moyo, he said that the government had allocated $2.9 billion to local authorities. That speaks to your 5%. However, reporting that we have to date states that only $183 million of $2.9 billion has been dispersed. And of course, the constitution provisions are 5% devolution funding, provincial and metropolitan council. So the question is, Mr. Churu, is will the balance of funds be availed to the councils this year? Because of course there's still a huge gap. There's only 2 months left to the year end. And also, why, bearing in mind that the constitution was passed in 2013, are we only starting to disperse in 2019 and 2020? Why did it take so long?
Well, I think let's just acknowledge that we didn't disburse these resources in the past. It's a bygone, but the good thing is that once we started to disburse devolution funds, we haven't looked back. We've been disbursing funds in the devolution funds in the last 2-3 years, and we've done it consistently, and we've been close to almost 5% of the minimum that is set in the constitution. True, you are correct that the bulk of the resources have not yet been disbursed. Maybe slightly worse than what it was last year, when at this particular time we were actually at, I think, 24%, but eventually the Treasury managed to disburse the funds. It's a constitutional requirement, and we are hopeful that Treasury will be able to meet the constitutional requirement. I'm mindful of the fact that this has not been an ordinary year. Treasury had to grapple with a lot of requirements. The economy was under the weather under COVID. And the resources to the fiscus, to the CRIF revenue resources may not have been as smooth as they would otherwise have been. But representing the local governance sector, I really am looking forward to the full 5% by the end of the year.
By the end of December?
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's good. Now,
yes.
David, local authorities have complained that disbursements have come in very late. In fact, you've heard from Mr. Churu on the numbers I gave you as reported, 183 million out of 2.9 billion. And of course, inflation and various macroeconomic issues have taken their toll on the value of the allocations that were budgeted for. And of course, that implies the ability of using those funds for the projects that were initially targeted for by the metropolitan and rural councils. And in some cases, it was reported that government allegedly accused local authorities of failing to spend devolution funds in the face of stark social service delivery shortcomings. So of course, you can comment on that. And also, how would you propose that this sort of challenge is resolved?
Well, yes, it's true. I've worked with a number of local authorities and they have made those complaints. That situation, in fact, that kind of delay of disbursement of devolution funds, it creates a conflict between the residents and the local authorities. And then thereafter it becomes a blame game between local authorities and government, like you have rightly said, that it's reported in the past that government has accused local authorities of failing to spend devolution funds. So I think as a way forward, government should just step up in terms of releasing these funds, because in any case,
as early as possible.
Yes, as early as possible, because in any case, local authorities are the ones which have the mandate to provide the most basic services which are very important for human development. That is your water and sanitation, your roads, your health, primary health, and also your education. So these resources will are so critical in terms of even economic production, because it's when a citizen has all the enabling environment that they are most productive. So I think one of the challenges perhaps government faces is that it probably collects its revenue, that is from tax, maybe on a quarterly basis, and then they would have then to spread the disbursement into those quotas. But I'm sure that there's something that government can do in terms of keeping up with the percentages of those commitments, making sure that in the first quarter they disburse 5% of what has come, and in the second quarter they disburse 5% of what has come.
With a rollout plan,
yes,
so to
and
speak.
they keep, yeah.
I mean, that will be good. That will be good for councils,
Yes.
or metropolitan councils, because then they can plan. I assume
They can plan,
and they can see the
because
project.
right now they are now overtaken by plans from.
Right, now we're now joined virtually by Dr. Davison Muchandianyika, independent local government expert. Davison, welcome to the Mint Special.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Now, Davison, briefly, can you give us, in your opinion, the pros and cons of devolution? And can it be effective or not in a Zimbabwean environment? And if so, why?
Okay, thanks very much. First and foremost, I think we need to acknowledge that devolution is vital in as far as the progress of any country is concerned. Having said that, one of the best advantages of devolution in the Zimbabwean context is to begin to share the national revenues between three tiers of government, which is something that has not been happening for the past, perhaps since 2013 up to around 2019. The other disadvantage is also to say that we are beginning to empower communities for them to participate in a number of development activities within their areas of jurisdiction. We are fully aware that the progress of humankind over centuries is predicated on the participation of local actors in the development process. However, on the flip side, we still have a number of challenges that I think they need to be ironed out for us to fully harness the benefits of devolution in Zimbabwe. Chief amongst them is that the legal infrastructure and the institutional infrastructure to support devolution as it is enshrined in the Constitution is not yet there. Let me qualify this. One of the fundamental things in any devolution framework whereby there is a sharing of resources between national government is to have an independent and objective institution, which is a constitutional body in many instances, in the form of, for instance, if you look into Kenya, they have what is called a Commission for Revenue Allocation. That is an independent body established by the Constitution to be responsible for determining the formula of sharing the resources. That is the vertical allocation and also the horizontal allocation. Why am I saying this? The sharing of resources should not be the responsibility of the executive, as in our case for now. If we leave it in the hands of the executive, we have challenges in as far as biases, which might be politically motivated. The second aspect that I think is critical for our devolution is to establish the intergovernmental relations framework in as far as to determine how do local authorities and provincial and metropolitan councils and the national government relate. In instances whereby there are conflicts, what are the dispute resolution mechanisms between the different tiers of government? So we see that we have moved a little bit, but we still need to do a lot of work in as far as putting the major pillars that make devolution work in any country.
So, Davison, as you know, Davison, we're coming up to what we always call in Zimbabwe budget season, and the Minister of Finance of Zimbabwe is compiling currently the budget for the 2021. So, if I had to ask you and put you on the spot, what recommendations would you submit to the ministry responsible for local government as well as finance around intergovernmental fiscal funds transfer, also bearing in mind your experience in other jurisdictions in Africa?
The first and foremost is I need to highlight that the preparation for the transfer framework is equally important. When I say preparations, I look at the formula. To say the formula for sharing the resources, it must be objective-based. It must be known by all the 92 local authorities. It must be known by communities. And the variables that are in the formula for sharing the resources. Remember that the 5% is shared between 10 provincial and metropolitan councils and 92 local authorities. So there has to be a formula for sharing between these two levels of government, vertically and also horizontal. So that formula, that's the basis. It has to be objective-based and known. Number two, there are issues of predictability in terms of the flows, as David had highlighted before, to say that it is essential that we know that the allocations are made on a quarterly basis or biannual basis. That has to be done. Number three, and most importantly, is to have a clear reporting and accounting frameworks. My thinking is that we should not necessarily look at devolution as an issue of financial resources only. It is an issue of service delivery within our communities. And having said that, the role of the Minister of Local Government becomes essential. I also think that the National Treasury need also to build the capacity of a team or a department within the Ministry of Local Government to be the hub or the infrastructure that supports the devolution of these resources and the use of these resources within local authorities. So that is very critical. The other aspect that I would look at, we should not lose sight of the fact that our local authorities, the bulk of funding of our local authorities, more than 80% of funding of our local government comes from on-source revenues. So we should not lose sight of the bedrock of our local government system. So we should then also be in a position to argue that our local authorities must be in a position to augment the 5% that comes from the national government with their own sources, which becomes important that as citizens and other players, business and government, we also honor our obligations to local authorities. This is to acknowledge that the 5% is not going to make magic alone in as far as development in our local authorities is concerned. We still need, again, to honor our obligations to local government. Right. And lastly, I would advise the National Treasury to look at what are the challenges that they faced over the past 2 years in terms of disbursements of devolution funds to local authorities. Are there any lessons that can be taken into consideration in the design of FY21 resources moving forward?
Dr. Davison Muchandianyika, independent local government expert, thank you so much for appearing on the Mint Special.
Okay, thanks very much.
Now it's time for us to take a breather. You're watching the Mint Special. Our discussion this morning, Intergovernmental Fiscal Funds Transfer Framework and the 2021 National Budget, implications for devolution. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network ZTN and our partners, the National Citizen Devolution Task Force, represented by the We Pay You Deliver Consortium. Now in our next segment, we ask, why has the Zimbabwean government restricted the usage of devolution funds to specific priority areas, and what are conditional and unconditional grants? The Mint Special will be right back. Don't go away.
Life will never be the same again.
Absolutely. How do you tell someone in Mbaria or in Soweto that they should exercise social distancing?
Every single one of us, barring a few, are praying more.
What is the health economic cost of what we are trying to achieve?
I don't know whether his chairman knows he runs at about 9 in the morning.
Yeah, I've just got the symptoms, so I just called the doctor and then he just advised me to have to stay at home, eh?
Welcome back. You're watching the MIN Special. Our discussion this morning: Intergovernmental Fiscal Funds Transfer Framework and the 2021 National Budget. Implications for devolution. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV network ZTN and the National Citizen Devolution Task Force, represented by the We Pay You Deliver Consortium. David, under devolution funding, there are what can be called two types of disbursements: conditional and unconditional grants. Can you explain what exactly is the difference between the two?
Okay, just from the words conditional, it means that you disburse funds to which you attach conditions, and perhaps it is to guide the local authorities on how and on what they should spend those funds. And then unconditional grants are free funds which you disperse to the local authorities, and then it's up to them to decide how and on what they
So it brings us to what Davidson talked about, the formula. Yeah. Because obviously if you're in a rural or metropolitan council, yeah, and you know that of the devolution funds you've applied for, X percentage should go to unconditional and Y percentage to conditional. Does that framework exist at the moment in the devolution?
From what we've seen in government disbursements, most of them, the devolution funds are to a certain extent meant to be unconditional in as far as the planning process is concerned, where it's the local authorities themselves from the bottom-up approach that decide on the projects and the programs which they want to spend that money on. The Constitution does say that this money should be spent on infrastructure, water and sanitation, health, education, and so on. So the condition in this case is inside the Constitution provision itself. But otherwise, those funds, from a planning perspective, the planning should be bottom-up and not top-down. So a framework needs to be, set up in terms of the planning process to ensure that there's no clash between, the top-down and the bottom-up approach. So you find that perhaps local authorities, to a certain extent, may start complaining that there is some kind of prescription that may come from the top-down approach in the planning process as government tries to align with its national planning framework,
which follows the Constitution, which says Zimbabwe's development. Mr. Chua, the Constitution, of course, has restricted the use of funds by local authorities to 6 priority areas, namely education, health, water, electricity, social amenities, and roads. That's a portion of the funds. There is an argument, of course, that it would appear, as David was mentioning there, that the allocation of these funds is taking a top-down rather than a bottom-up approach. So really, can this be really referred to as devolution funds, I think, is the first question. And the second question is critics have further alleged that local authorities should be the ones to determine what devolution funds are spent on because they know the conditions in their own local areas. Your comment?
Thank you, Andy. My reading of the Constitution is that it does not quite prescribe. The areas you mentioned are the ones which are explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. But the local authorities can spend those resources on other capital projects of their choice. But I'm sure those who crafted the Constitution had in mind our level of development and the needs that we face at the moment in order to spur development in communities. And this is why those particular areas were mentioned specifically. But they are just by way of example.
Guidance.
They are just a guidance, basically. Okay. Yes.
Okay.
Because even if you look at, even for central government, these are the areas where we spend most of our resources But it's not the reflection that these are the only areas where one can spend resources.
Yeah, because of course each local authority or metropolitan or rural council, they obviously have different needs.
True.
One size cannot fit all. But however, education, water, sanitation,
That's
roads
right.
is probably standard.
True.
But each of them does have the option to then ask government for funding, devolution funding for specific projects in their own areas that relate to the good of the citizens in their community. All right, brilliant. We're now joined virtually, I understand, by Dr. Vincent Chakunda. He's from Midland State University. Vincent, are you there? Welcome to the Mint Special.
Thank you so much. I'm here.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, well, welcome. Vincent, you've been listening to what my panelists in studio have said. So what are your comments on unconditional grants? And more importantly, how much authority should the central government have in prescribing what projects grants should be utilized for under each type of funding?
Okay, thank you so much for that question. I followed actually what Devson was saying and colleagues in the studio related to the modalities of the 5% as stated in our constitution. Now coming to your issue on grants, there's only one problem where central government is actually prescribing or directing local authorities as to how they should spend the money. Why? Because it also does not give the discretion for local authorities to pursue their strategic options as given in their strategic plans. Mind you, we have 92 local authorities that are pursuing those similar but to an extent different projects depending on the felt needs of their communities. So my argument, my submission then would be we must allow a reasonable latitude, we must allow a reasonable discretion on local authorities to invest in particular capital projects that is a dividend to their communities, but subject to an agreed strategic option between the local authority and the residents within that particular local authority area. So I will insist that rather let's give the local authorities the opportunity to invest the money unconditionally, but in line with the felt needs of their community.
Okay, so you're prescribing then that the local authorities should have total command over how they spend the funds. It takes me to our next question then. The broader significance of intergovernmental funds transfer to local authorities and the impact of delivery of municipal services in general. You should see an impact on devolution funding. It should improve the lives of citizens in the various councils and rural and metropolitan councils around the country.
Okay, I'm not getting your question.
I'm saying that the broader significance between intergovernmental funds transfers to local government, local authorities, and the impact on service delivery. I'm saying that we should be seeing enhanced service delivery in metropolitan and rural councils due to devolution funding. Is that correct?
Yes, of course, we should be seeing some significant development, particularly in the investment on capital projects in local authorities. Mind you, perhaps just to give you a background, this is to date the most significant source of financing for capital projects. Why? Because previously you saw government abandoning the public sector investment program and the limited funding that local authorities are now getting through concessional loans and the publicly guaranteed loans, particularly from outside the country. So what it means, that's the only viable investment funding for local authorities now. Unfortunately, the money, though we are talking of it in millions of dollars, but again, you should also consider the inflationary pressures on the money to the extent that the real value of this money, say against the US dollar, is limited. Why? Because for local authorities, you find the majority or the major source of their equipment is imported. So we should also be looking at how these monies are making an impact given the inflationary pressures that are also affecting or eroding the value of these monies that are coming from or that are being given to local authorities.
All right,
I admit that it is indeed a valuable source, a valuable avenue of financing strategic capital investment projects in local authorities.
Okay, Vincent, please stay on the line. We will come back to you. David, I want to again look at the devolution and decentralization policy document, and it states, and I quote, "Devolved government structures are expected under the Constitution to directly submit their estimates of expenditures as approved by their councils to the Treasury." You've heard the various comments here on the program this morning, and again, I ask you the same question: do you believe that government should be able to prescribe what projects devolution funds can be spent on? And in your opinion, is this what you believe was envisioned in the Zimbabwe's, in the constitution, and of course the Zimbabwe's government's policy and citizens' understanding of devolution as well?
No, I don't think so. Constitutions really come from the people. We had a referendum, yes, but I think that maybe some of the framing of the questions, which resulted in the provisions that we have, where we have some form of condition, it's implicit in some of the provisions. Devolution should speak to, empowerment of the people to determine, to have the discretion through their local authorities on how and on what they want to spend. So I don't believe that, there should be conditions attached. And speaking to the policy, I think that there's need to distinguish between decentralization and devolution. Devolution is a form of decentralization, but the way that these terms are used in the policy, sometimes they leave they leave the questions begging around whether there is a real commitment to devolution, because deconcentration is not devolution. And deconcentration is just mere extension of central government to the lower levels and where you have that kind of extension, sometimes you blur responsibility. You don't know who's actually responsible for what. So that kind of confusion needs to be, the policy, the decentralization policy needs to be fumigated from that kind of...
Mr. Chu, you've heard the panelists, and I believe what they're calling for is let councils, basically do what they want in terms of devolution funding, in terms of the projects they want to identify in their areas. And I'm sure you'd want to comment on that, because of course 2.9 billion going out there and letting councils do it, and also that, and also possibly the aspect of local taxation given to local authorities, and of course where income tax is kept by government, local taxation into rural district councils. That whole fundraising issue as well, please.
I think I'll comment briefly and mention the fact that there is one statement which is mentioned, I think, several times in the Constitution, which is that Zimbabwe is a unitary state. Whatever happens at the central government, provincial council level, at the local authority level, should work towards one objective. Hence, even as we empower local authorities to manage their own affairs and economic development, at the national level, we must be working towards one thing. And as you do so, you'll find that there is no tier of government which is totally free to do what it wants. There should be checks and balances in the process. The question is, are they reasonable? And I believe what we have now is quite reasonable. There are areas that we can improve upon. That's the nature of governance. Thank you.
All right, well, it's time for us to take a breather. You're watching the Mint Special, our discussion this morning, Intergovernmental Fiscal Funds Transfer Framework and the 2021 National Budget, Implications for Devolution. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, the National Citizen Devolution Task Force, represented by the We Pay You Deliver Consortium. After the breather, we ask, why has a legal framework covering devolution as stipulated for in the Constitution of Zimbabwe not yet been put in place? And do local authorities have capacity to effectively utilize devolution funding? And what key recommendations, if any, should be submitted for inclusion in Zimbabwe's 2021 budget concerning intergovernmental fiscal funds transfer? We'll be right back. Please don't go away. Welcome back. This is the Mint Special. Our discussion this morning, Intergovernmental Fiscal Funds Transfer Framework and the 2021 National Budget, implications for devolution. This broadcast is brought to you by Zim Papers TV Network, ZTN, and our partners, the National Citizen Devolution Task Force, represented by the We Pay You Deliver Consortium. Mr. Chua, very recently, the combined Harare Residents Association, Community Water Alliance, and Member of Parliament Rusty Markham won a High Court case compelling the government to put in place supporting legislation on devolution. The High Court ordered, and I quote, any or all of the respondents shall within a period of 6 months, that is to say by 31st of March 2021, submit a bill or bills for gazetting by the Parliament of Zimbabwe, which bill or bills will give effect to an act of Parliament governing the devolution of powers. Now, I suppose the initial question that I would have is, why was this court case necessary in the first place if the enabling constitution or the fact that you had to be put in place is actually already there in the constitution? And also, what are government's plans in line with this judgment?
Well, I don't know whether you're asking the correct person. I don't know whether it was really necessary for the honorable member and the two associations to take this matter up before the courts. But I have to admit, it's their constitutional right. As you are aware, we've been, since 2014, aligning so many laws with the Constitution. And the laws to do with devolution, that is ensuring that there's proper coordination between the various tiers of government, and that the laws that existed prior to the promulgation of the new constitution and the coming in of the constitution are also aligned, is an ongoing process. The process is not just stored within the executive arm of government. Sometimes it is also stored in the legislature. Because, as you are aware, of necessity, whenever laws are promulgated, there's a consultative process, and that has to be taken into account. There are no shortcuts in that regard. Having said that, I would like to point out that we are actually undertaking a process of ensuring that the laws are aligned with the Constitution, and that we have adequate legal framework that enables us to undertake the needed coordination. So taking into account the fact that this is an ongoing process, I don't know whether it was necessary to bring up the court case, but it's their legal rights. Yeah.
So 31st of March, hopefully we will have a new
we hope so.
David, you know, I mean, as it's been clear and the court case has proven, government has been dispersing money without that legal framework in place. So the organizations that took the ministry to court or the government to court to win this judgment, they said that it would give citizens the opportunity to participate in the drafting of the legislation now that they've done that. And so how do you personally, how does your organization intend to get involved? I mean, the ministry is here. How do you intend to get involved in assisting the ministry to draft the appropriate legislation that you believe suits your members in the local authorities, metropolitan and rural councils?
Certainly we have positions that we want included in whatever legislation that empower citizens. So I think that government should spread its net wide when it's consulting stakeholders. I mean, it doesn't take rocket science to know that residents associations, wherever they are, you know, should sit at the table when these provisions or legislations are being crafted or proposed. So they should sit at the table, and government should try and find out what the people really want, because whatever they come up with, if the people don't quite agree, they may not participate meaningfully. And as you know, local authorities work with citizens paying up their obligations. So I think that generally you find that perhaps the provincial metropolitan council's bill is something that could be part of the legislation that CRA and the other Community Water Alliance were really talking about, but it could go beyond that, beyond the Blue Book. It's not sufficient to say that the 5% is catered for by the Blue Book. I think there's need for concrete provisions in legislation, something which is quite apart from the Blue Book, which stipulates the formula, the institutions which should really guide this formula and adjudicate on how the funds should be dispersed.
So, Mr. Cho, you heard the citizens representative here with us. You are going to involve, I assume, as much wide participation in terms of consultation when it comes to legislation. I mean, is that something the ministry can assure us?
Definitely, Andy. Whenever we come up with legislation, there's consultation. And even as we stand now, the citizens are quite allowed to bring in their own suggestions.
Oh, there we go.
Well, the law is not yet in place.
All right, Vincent, hello there.
Yes, I'm here.
Vincent, you know, one question which has always come up is that while local authorities are clamoring for immediate disbursement of the funding for devolution, it appears, however, that some local authorities may not have the internal capacity to manage and utilize such funds effectively. What is your comment on that?
Yeah, indeed, the issue of capacity is quite important. There is no way we can say that all local authorities have the capacity to manage the devolution fund. Perhaps taking from what we saw in the AGC report for the year ended 2018, you found that of the 92 local authorities that we have in this country, only 3, and I mean only 3, managed to submit final accounts for auditing that were up to date. But that cannot be used as an excuse not to devolve. Why? Because even the national government in certain areas may find it lacking capacity. So what we should rather be focusing on is to identify the various capacity gaps and needs and begin to develop a program to address those capacity gaps. So my strongest thinking, or my thinking is that capacity is something that we can develop, capacity is something that we can build, and it must never be used as an excuse not to develop.
Thank you.
To develop.
Yeah, Mr. Chu, you heard that, and what is your ministry's opinion about this capacity issue in local authorities with the ability to utilize devolution funding effectively? And also, of course, the major concern and the major issue that's going on now is corruption. How do we safeguard the non-corruptive element in terms of devolution funding? Is it up to the ministry to put in place these kind of mechanisms and also this kind of capacity building? What would you?
Let me point out that capacity building is a key feature of our interaction with local authorities. We recognize that there are capacity gaps in the local authorities in various areas, including in financial management. And we've got so many capacity development programs where we try to assist them so that they can be able to manage their resources more efficiently and more effectively. And we also work with the development partners in that particular regard. But let me also point out that I don't think that the government of Zimbabwe has given a very strict precondition that we can only devolve when local authorities have got 100% capacity. We would not have made that first disbursement that we made of devolution funds. Even now, when you read the press and you read about challenges of capacity and sometimes of fraud and of corruption that sometimes takes place in some of the local authorities, one could have, but still we are sticking to the 5% rule. But on the other hand, just like I mentioned earlier on, we should not be negligent. It would be negligent on our part to ignore the fact that the local authorities face challenges. Yes, even the other tiers of government also may face challenges, but we cannot ignore the fact that the 2.9 billion is going to the local authorities.
Will the ministry come in and help these local authorities in need for capacity and making sure that they do the right thing in terms of disbursement?
We do. In fact, on a continuous basis, we always do that.
Okay, David, very briefly, because we have
I
to
wanted
wind
to
up.
say that the Constitution also places the responsibility on oversight of these things, of these funds, to Parliament. Section 2991, Parliament must monitor and oversee expenditure by the state and all commissions and institutions and agencies of government at every level, including statutory bodies, government-controlled entities, provincial, metropolitan councils, and local authorities, in order to ensure that all revenues are accounted for, all expenditure has been properly incurred, and any limits and conditions on appropriations have been observed. So that function is clearly located in Parliament, and the executive is not mentioned, at least in this provision.
Okay, but
not to say that they don't have a monitoring role, which is essentially, it's about information, collecting information and making sure that Parliament is serviced in terms of the information that it needs in order to provide that oversight.
Mr. Chu, you have a quick comment because we're coming to the...
Yes, I can only comment that the reason why we've got an Auditor General's Department, we've got an Accountant General's Department, and the Accountant General's Department is actually part of the executive. And we've got the Urban Councils Act, Rural District Councils Act, and the provisions that are therein with respect to responsibilities towards local authorities is to ensure that there are checks and balances.
Checks and balances, that's the key.
The issue is just to use those responsibly.
Okay. Right, now we are coming to the end of our program, but I'd just like to pose this question to my panelists. Vincent, I want to start with you. 2021 national budget is currently being crafted. So briefly, what would your recommendations be to both the Ministry of Local Government and Public Works and the Ministry of Finance about what should be included in that budget with regards to intergovernmental fiscal funds transfers?
Okay. I would have wanted to make a contribution on a clear framework to be used to underpin this, with clear variables. Because it appears now that the approach is quite ad hoc and it can hardly be used for strategic planning purposes. Why? Because we would want a formula or a criteria that is relatively predictable by local authorities, so that if they are also doing their plans, they can know what they are likely to get from central government, so that it becomes an important part of their planning process, not just for central government to give without a clear framework that can be used then to...
Okay, thank you. David, your final comments. What would you recommend in terms of...
As the National Citizens Devolution Task Force has always advocated for, we need an independent body to be the institution that drives the process of devolution, where government comes to sit at the table and citizens come to sit at the table, local authorities as equals, where this organization or this institution is an independent institution. We can't have government playing both referee and player. And I would also want to say that if you, another point which I just thought about as we were discussing, you know, the Public Finance Management Act, it talks about public entities, but local authorities, since the advent of the 2013 Constitution, are now constitutional entities. So they need to resolve this issue of approval system, because as constitutional entities, there's no requirement for them to have their budgets approved. That should be an administrative issue where government incentivizes local authorities to submit.
All right, we are coming to him, but Mr. Chu, just a brief final word. I just wanted to get this from you. The fact is this: the ministry is open to all citizens, whether it be representatives of Residents' Trust, whether it be councils, whoever, to come forward, give their views and ideas for serious discussion with the ministry to put into legislation and put into the national budget. Can you confirm that?
I can confirm that, and I would like to mention that we don't disburse resources on an ad hoc basis. There's actually a formula.
Okay.
A formula based on population, poverty prevalence, and infrastructure. There is no jurisdiction where this is a universal accepted. It's always contagious, even when you go to South Africa. But it's a known formula, and we can share it with colleagues.
I think that's where the disconnect is. That no one knows that formula. So that there you go. Please contact the ministry. You have the formula.
I am aware of that.
Oh, well, there you go.
But
okay.
I think ministry needs to make sure that it disseminates that information widely.
Okay, well, here we go. This is the first start. Now we have come to the end of our program, and it's a very interesting topic because devolution does affect you and me, and in fact every citizen in this country, and it's vital in terms of governance to decentralize governments down to us, the people. You have been watching the Mint Special this morning. Our discussion, Intergovernmental Fiscal Funds Transfer Framework and the 2021 National Budget, implications for devolution. We'd like to thank our panelists, Vinachimwe Churu, his Permanent Secretary in Zimbabwe's Ministry of Local Government and Public Works, David Matumbike, National Coordinator for the Local Governance Trust, Dr. Vincent Chakunda, Midland State University, Dr. Davison Muchandenyika, Independent Local Government Expert. Gentlemen, thank you for appearing on the Mint Special.
Thank you very much, Andy.
This broadcast is brought to you by Zimpapers TV network ZTN and our partners, the National Citizen Devolution Task Force, represented by the We Pay You Deliver Consortium. Well, that's it for me this morning. All I can say is have a fantastic day. Goodbye, and you all be safe.